Brenda Joyce Holland was born on July 8, 1947, the second of Geraldine and Charles "Shotgun" Holland's 4 children. She was born and raised in the mountains of western North Carolina, where her family ties went back for generations. The Hollands lived in the town of Canton, where the economy relied heavily on the local paper mill, where Brenda's father worked as a floor manager. Brenda's parents felt secure in the community and hoped their children would remain in the relative safety of their mountains. Brenda's ambitions would take her away from Canton, but she was mindful of her parents' feelings and getting their approval as she went after each of her goals. While some of her choices may have seemed drastic to her parents, Brenda took their concerns into consideration when making her plans. Brenda was the first member of her family to attend college. Her family physician, Dr. Matthews, had encouraged her to enroll at Campbell College. The small Baptist institution was in North Carolina, but still nearly 300 miles away in the town of Buies Creek. Brenda's father was not opposed to his daughter receiving a college education, but her mother was worried about paying for college and about her daughter being so far away from home. With the help of Dr. Matthews, Brenda was able to work out the logistical concerns of going away to school and got her mother to agree to letting her attend. Brenda eventually wanted to move off of campus and into a boarding house run by a local widow, but knew this would be pushing her parents' limits. She ultimately secured their permission by taking care of the necessary preparations and by appealing to the amount of money the move would save each month. Brenda became very active with the drama program at the school and soon got a paid position as a costumer for the Campbell Players. She was successful in this position due to both her creativity and her hardworking nature. She considered staying on campus during a semester break to do more for the department because she was concerned that completing her assigned tasks alone did not merit the paycheck she received. Brenda dreamed of having a career in theater and considered moving to New York City to work odd jobs while making connections with the Broadway community. However, she knew that her parents would never approve of such a plan, and therefore made slightly more local arrangements for her employment over the summer of 1967, following her sophomore year of college. Brenda had been hired to be the makeup supervisor for The Lost Colony, an outdoor symphonic drama that had been staged in the town of Manteo in North Carolina's Outer Banks since 1937. While a local production may not seem comparable to a Broadway play, working on The Lost Colony was a major opportunity for Brenda. The play, which details the history and mystery of the Roanoke colony and the unexplained disappearance of more than 100 of its settlers, continues to be a major and respected production to this day. During the 1966 season, the year before Brenda was hired to work on the play, more than 145,000 tickets had been sold for the outdoor performance throughout its summer run. As of 2022, more than 4 million people have seen the production, and it received an honorary Tony Award in 2013. Working on The Lost Colony would allow Brenda to work with multiple individuals in the theater community with experience within and outside of North Carolina. Her position as the makeup supervisor gave her the chance to work under famed costumer Irene Smart Rains, famous for her work as the costume director for the Carolina Playmakers at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Joe Layton, who directed and choreographed The Lost Colony for the 1967 season, had extensive credits working on Broadway and in television. One of the most popular television stars of the time also had ties to The Lost Colony and to Manteo. Andy Griffith, who in 1967 was near the end of the 8-season run of his successful eponymous television show, owned a home in Manteo and spent time there when he wasn't filming. His love of the town stemmed from his time there working on The Lost Colony. One of his earliest stage roles had been as a soldier in the play, and he would return for several more seasons, eventually playing the role of Sir Walter Raleigh. As good of an opportunity working on The Lost Colony would be for Brenda, her parents did not want her moving even farther away from their home for the summer. They instead wanted her to come home to Canton and go back to her job at a local drive-in, arguing that she would make more than the $45 a week she would earn working on the play by doing so. They eventually relented and signed off on her employment contract for the summer, as was required at the time. Brenda's parents were frustrated to learn that their daughter ultimately would be unable to come home to see them at the end of her spring semester before heading to the coast to start work on the play. The last time they had seen her was at the end of March for Easter. This meant they had not seen Brenda since she had decided to dramatically change her hair on May 12th, dyeing it blonde and cutting it into a stylish bob. On May 31st, 1967, Brenda caught a ride from Buies Creek to Manteo from a fellow Campbell student who had occasionally taken Brenda out on dates and was a native of Manteo. For the summer, Brenda would share an efficiency apartment on the upper level of a local family's home with another student working on the Lost Colony for the season. Brenda's dedication to her job quickly earned her the respect of those she worked with, and she built up a social life in Manteo based largely around the play. She quickly began integrating into the Lost Colony community and the coastal community of Manteo. While Brenda may not have been living a conservative lifestyle by her parents' standards, she was social and curious rather than wild and rebellious. She mainly attended parties not to drink or cause trouble, but for the opportunity to speak to a variety of people, sometimes ending the night still holding the same beer she had started the night with. She went out on casual dates with a few men in the weeks following her arrival in Manteo, with her supervisor from the play keeping a watchful eye on her and giving her advice on how to avoid being taken advantage of. Unable to spend time with her younger brother and sister, as she was accustomed to, Brenda got to know the younger members of the cast and crew, including a 13-year-old boy who sold seat cushions at the theater. He had suffered from rheumatoid arthritis and had never learned to swim, so Brenda taught him how to at Nag's Head Beach and reassured him when he struggled. Brenda kept in touch with her parents by regularly sending them letters. At the performance of The Lost Colony on July 1st, 1967, everything seemed perfectly normal to the audience, but backstage, the cast and crew was growing concerned. Brenda Holland had not shown up for work. While an unexplained absence may not have been cause for alarm when it came to some members of the crew, when it was Brenda involved, it was. While she had only been working on the play for a month, she had never missed a shift. Furthermore, Cora Twyford, who performed as a colonist in the play and was Brenda's landlady, reported that Brenda had not come home the night before. While it was common for some of her boarders to stay out all night, like Brenda's roommate, who had not arrived home until 7 a.m. that morning, it was unheard of for Brenda to do so. Brenda had left after the previous night's performance with Danny Barber, a chorus singer in the play, to go out on a date. At intermission, Cora Twyford and the play's general manager asked Danny when he had last seen Brenda. At first, he stated that he had dropped her off in front of the house where she was staying. When Cora told him she knew that this wasn't true, because Brenda had never come home, he admitted that he and Brenda had gone back to his house after their date. They had been talking and reading magazines in his room, and he fell asleep. When he woke up that morning, Brenda was gone, and he assumed that at some point after he fell asleep, she had walked the few blocks back to where she was staying on her own. The general manager called the sheriff's office to report Brenda missing at 9:20 p.m. and drove over programs for the play, which contained a photo of Brenda, to the office after the conclusion of the night's performance. After a sleepless night, he called the sheriff's office again at 6 o'clock the following morning to reiterate his concerns and try to get the investigation pushed forward, even though it was a Sunday. The sheriff's investigation began that morning, and alerts about Brenda's disappearance went out throughout the state. However, notifying Brenda's family that she was missing proved difficult, as no one was answering the phone at the family home. Brenda's older sister Anne learned that her sister was missing through a radio broadcast she heard over the AM radio in her car on her way home from church Sunday evening. Anne knew why her family had not answered their phone and why no one in Canton was able to find them. The family had gone to stay at a remote trailer they owned near Lake Glenville, an hour west of Canton. The trailer had no phone, so once Anne notified the Hayward County Sheriff's Office of their location, a deputy was sent out to notify Brenda's parents of her disappearance. The Holland family had gone to bed early that night, so they were all asleep when the deputy arrived. After learning their daughter was missing, Brenda's parents quickly packed up and left for Canton so that they could drop off their 2 youngest children with their oldest daughter and her family before continuing on to Manteo to help look for Brenda. On Monday morning, approximately 75 volunteers joined sheriff's deputies in a search for Brenda. Most of the volunteers were cast or crew members from the lost colony. The scale of the search increased over the following few days. Helicopters from the Coast Guard searched from the air, and soldiers from the Marines joined the effort. The search parties grew as Brenda's family members and fellow students at Campbell College arrived to help. On July 6th, at 10:15 in the morning, a pilot with the Civil Air Patrol spotted something in the Albemarle Sound, off the coast of a small fishing village northwest of Manteo. When he circled back at a lower altitude to look again, he realized that the object in the water below was in fact a human body. He radioed in what he had found and circled the area so as to not lose sight of it until law enforcement arrived. The body was pulled from the water and confirmed to be Brenda Holland. Brenda's body was driven to Norfolk, Virginia, so that her autopsy could be performed at the office of the Virginia State Medical Examiner. North Carolina did not have a statewide medical examiner's office at the time, and the facility in Virginia was the closest one with the best equipment and experienced pathologists. Brenda had wounds around her neck, and the pathologist found that she had died as the result of ligature strangulation. He also found signs that Brenda had been raped. Whether or not rape was the motive for Brenda's murder is not entirely certain. Investigators were initially confused as to why her killer would redress her so exactly after raping her. When her body was found, she was still wearing her underwear, a bodysuit, and a tight skirt, still completely buttoned up. Furthermore, witness accounts of statements made by Brenda indicate that the injuries that pointed to her being raped may have been inflicted in a separate incident. Days before her death, Brenda had confided in her supervisor, Irene Rains, that she had a bad experience while on a date with a local man she had been seeing. Brenda stated, "I'm no good," and said that she would no longer be seeing the man. She further confided in Danny Barber, her date on her last evening alive, about the incident. During an interview with authorities, he stated that Brenda had told him about this man and his mistreatment of her. He said she told him about him going to bed with her, about the rough treatment. It was very repulsive, and it had changed her outlook on life. If Brenda had been raped by this man while on a date earlier on in the week, these specific injuries found on her body may not have been connected to her murder, but rather to the earlier assault, leaving the question of whether or not she had been raped just prior to her murder open. Brenda's body was taken back to Canton for her funeral and burial. Her parents received mourners at a local funeral home on the evening of July 8th, the day that should have been Brenda's 20th birthday. Her funeral was held the following afternoon at her family church, and she was buried in a lot in the cemetery her parents had purchased just a few years earlier, with the belief that their children will be burying them there first. Some of the friends Brenda had made during her time in Manteo, while working on the lost colony, traveled to Canton for her funeral. 100 other members of the cast and crew attended a memorial service held for her back in Manteo, which was held at the same time as the service in Canton. Dare County Sheriff Frank Cahoon quickly zeroed in on Brenda's last date, Danny Barber, as his main suspect, and Danny was one of the first people he contacted when Brenda went missing. 24-year-old Danny had served 3 years in the Army, where he had been a member of the U.S. Army Band and was a student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. 1967 was his third season as a singer in The Lost Colony. According to Danny, after the performance on June 30th, he and Brenda had gone to a bar where they each had one beer, and then to Jeanette's Pier to watch people who were shark fishing. They returned to the home he was sharing with two housemates just after 2 a.m. and went up to Danny's bedroom because they did not want to make noise in the living room and disturb one of Danny's housemates, who they knew was home. Danny and Brenda then talked for a while and kissed, but did not have sex. They then passed a magazine back and forth, reading articles to each other. At some point, Danny fell asleep and woke up hours later to find Brenda gone. He assumed she had just walked home, rather than wake him up to get a ride. When first asked about when he last saw Brenda by the play's general manager on July 1st, Danny at first lied and said he had dropped her off at the home where she was staying, around 2 a.m., when he had in fact taken her to his place at that time, and had never taken her home. This initial falsehood made him look suspicious, although it may have been the product of Danny's more conservative nature, rather than him having something to hide. Danny would later tell the play's general manager that he was afraid of Brenda's boss, Irene Raines. Irene was very concerned about the young people who worked under her, and if she had thought that the interactions between crew members was inappropriate, she would not hesitate to confront them about it. Danny, unaware of the seriousness of the situation at the time of the questioning, may not have wanted Irene to find out that he had been alone in his bedroom with Brenda. Furthermore, Danny's failure to take Brenda home seems to have violated his own understanding of gentlemanly conduct. According to Cora Twyford's daughter Penny, Danny came to their house to apologize to her mother for failing to see Brenda safely back to the room Cora was renting out to her. He appeared to have recognized that he made a mistake and was upset over it. Regardless of the reason for this initial lie, Danny was still the last known person to have seen Brenda, and he admitted to being alone with her in his bedroom. It was not inconceivable to the sheriff that he may have wanted more from Brenda sexually, and killed her when she did not consent. However, Danny's version of events did appear to be supported by a statement from his housemate, who had been in his room that night. He heard Danny and a girl go up to Danny's room, and was woken up later that night by the sound of the front door opening, and someone quietly exiting the house. He did not, however, hear any signs of a struggle inside the house, or the sound of a car starting up after the door to the house was opened. If Danny had killed Brenda in his room, he would have needed to get her downstairs and transport her by car to the water to dispose of her body, which would have created a lot of noise. What the housemate heard sounds more in line with Brenda waking up and deciding to walk home, rather than waking up Danny to drive her. While Brenda's parents were in town when her body was found, and could have identified it in a more clinical setting, Sheriff Cahoon apparently hoped to rattle his prime suspect with the sight of Brenda's badly decomposed body. Danny Barber was therefore brought in to identify Brenda's body, as it lay in a hearse near where it was found. Danny had to step away for a moment after seeing her, but then confirmed that it was Brenda. He based his identification off of a necklace Brenda always wore, which she had been given for winning Miss Congeniality in the Miss Hayward County beauty pageant the year before. Danny came in for multiple, often hours-long interviews, including one that kept him from attending Brenda's memorial service in the days after her body was found. Danny would later state that nothing he told the officers seemed to convince them that he hadn't killed Brenda. His brother eventually convinced him to hire a lawyer, who placed limits on law enforcement's access to Danny. Authorities remained focused on Danny in their investigation and continued to put pressure on him. An agent from the State Bureau of Investigation was in the audience of every performance of The Lost Colony Danny sang in for the rest of the summer. Agents from the SBI interviewed Danny twice in Chapel Hill after he returned to school, once in November of 1967 and once in April of 1968. The SBI tracked his changes in residence and his employment as he entered the corporate world after graduation in the following years. Those who knew Danny and Brenda generally did not believe Danny could have had anything to do with Brenda's murder. Whispers of his involvement nevertheless persisted throughout town, with a popular rumor maintaining that Danny left Manteo at the end of the summer of 1967 and never returned, which some believed pointed towards his guilt. This was not true, however. Dan, as he was known once he began his successful career in business, vacationed in Dare County with his family regularly, with their last trip occurring just months before he passed away. He took his wife Diane, and later their 2 children, to see the lost colony. He told Diane about Brenda's murder and how police had tried to pin the crime on him. She does not believe that her husband could have returned to Manteo, much less brought his family there, had he been involved. The 2 main emotions he seems to have felt about the events of the summer of 1967 were genuine confusion over how anyone could have wanted to harm Brenda, and gratitude for his brother insisting he retain a lawyer when he did not know what to do in the face of intense interrogation. Dan was contacted by the FBI again in 1985 and 1995, and according to the FBI files, he was open and cooperative. He retired as Vice President of National Sales for Sara Lee Hosiery in 1994 and turned his attention back to his love of singing and performing. Dan Barber passed away unexpectedly in January of 2011, just days after his 68th birthday. While Dan Barber was the most popular suspect with law enforcement, years after Brenda's murder, new information would point to a new suspect who had no connection to Brenda at all and no chance of being convicted of the crime, as he was by then long since deceased. For many years, Dr. Linus Edwards was the only dentist in Manteo. On Valentine's Day of 1971, Dr. Edwards went to the home of Dr. Harvey, Manteo's general practitioner, to drop off the set of dentures he had ordered. Dr. Harvey and his wife were at a Valentine's Day party, but had left their front door unlocked, so Dr. Edwards went inside and left the dentures on the dining room table. Early that evening, Dr. Edwards made 3 phone calls, one to his lawyer, one to Sheriff Cahoon, and one to Dr. Harvey, asking them to come to his house. He then shot himself in the head with his .22 caliber pistol. His lawyer discovered him lying on his kitchen floor when he arrived at the house an hour after being called there. Dr. Edwards was taken to the Naval Hospital in Norfolk, Virginia, where he remained unconscious until 5 a.m. on February 16th, when he finally died. He did not leave a suicide note. Edwards was a native of Durham, North Carolina, and a member of Mensa, something he was very proud of. He served as a dentist with the United States Army, eventually reaching the rank of lieutenant colonel. Edwards was also a violent drunk. While Edwards was still in the Army, he once choked his wife so savagely and intently that her young daughter had to threaten him with a mallet to get him to stop. He was granted an honorable discharge after undergoing psychiatric treatment, just 3 years before he would have been eligible for his full military pension. Edwards' first wife Ida had divorced him after 20 years of marriage in 1956, and then remarried him in 1960, with this marriage lasting just a few years. It was during the second attempt at their marriage that Edwards came to Manteo, which did not have a dental office at the time, and opened a successful practice. Following his second divorce from Ida, Edwards married Dottie Fry, a young widow with 2 children and a long-standing family history in Manteo. He and Dottie were married from 1964 until 1969, during which time Dottie was subjected to violence and abuse. Edwards physically beat his wife, at least once so badly that she needed to be hospitalized, and she and her children had to flee the home they shared with Edwards on multiple occasions. Edwards would regularly get blackout drunk, which would lead to physical and/or verbal abuse. While Edwards himself had an ongoing affair during the marriage, he was very jealous and controlling of Dottie's interactions with others. He did not like her having any friends, whether they were male or female. Edwards was briefly considered a suspect in Brenda's murder after investigators received tips that he and his wife, who bore a strong physical resemblance to Brenda Holland, had domestic difficulties on the night of June 30th, and that he had drunkenly gone out that night looking for her after she fled their home. Edwards agreed to undergo a polygraph examination and passed. However, while these exams are notoriously unreliable under the best of circumstances, Edwards may also have had advantages that helped him appear truthful during the test. Just after the time Brenda was killed, he began wearing an upper body cast for some sort of unexplained neck or back injury, and he secured a prescription for Demerol. As John Raley would later write, blackout drunks free of feelings of guilt and zonked out on Demerol, as Edwards might have been, can sail through the tests. Early on in the investigation, Edwards told law enforcement that his wife probably wouldn't talk to them, so they did not attempt to contact her. She might not have been forthcoming at that time because she was afraid of her husband, but investigators simply taking Edwards at his word shows an unusual amount of deference. Edwards' car and home were never searched. Edwards was formally ruled out as a suspect in September of 1967. While Dottie may have been too afraid to speak with investigators while she was still married to Edwards, even if they had asked her, she was willing to speak with them after his death. However, they were not as interested in hearing from her. Former Manteo Police Chief Ken Whittingham never formally had jurisdiction over Brenda's case because her body had been found outside of city limits, but that did not diminish his interest in the case while he was with the department, or after his departure from it in 1974. In 1979, while looking into the case on his own, Ken spoke to Dottie Fry. His notes indicate that on January 21st of that year, she had told him that she had unsuccessfully tried to speak to both Sheriff Cahoon and an SBI agent named Lenny Wise multiple times about her ex-husband's potential involvement in Brenda's murder, but neither man was interested in speaking with her. It seemed to Dottie that they were both still convinced of Danny Barber's guilt. 6 years later, journalist Ray Pye was working on investigative pieces on Brenda's murder for the Outer Banks Current, and Ken was one of the people who spoke to him about the case. After learning about Ken's conversation with Dottie Fry, Ray contacted the SBI by phone in December of 1985 and told them of the importance of speaking with both Dottie and Ken. On April 7, 1986, almost 19 years after Brenda's murder, investigators finally interviewed Dottie Fry, and her statement provided important evidence pointing to her former husband being Brenda's killer. This interview was brief, and Dottie told her general theory of what she believed happened the night Brenda was killed, but she more fully elaborated on the events of that night in an article written by Ray Pye and published on August 7, 1986. Dottie's children spent a large part of their summers with their father's family in Carthage, North Carolina, some 200 miles away from Manteo, so Dottie was alone with Edwards on the evening of June 30th, 1967, when he, not surprisingly, became belligerently drunk. He started yelling at Dottie, and she yelled back. He told her he was going to kill her. Dottie decided not to stay to see if he meant it. She fled the house before the altercation became physical. She got into her van and went to pick up her best friend. They drove around for the rest of the night, making a few stops throughout the Manteo area. At least the beginning of Dottie's account was corroborated by two of her neighbors. Because her windows had been open that night, their neighbors heard the fight, Edwards threatening Dottie, and Dottie's van driving away. They also later heard Edwards' car driving away. At least one of Dottie's friends also reported Edwards showing up at her house and angrily looking through each room in the home for Dottie that night. Dottie waited a few days for her husband to sober up before returning home. When Edwards came home and saw her there, he went pale and said, "I thought you were dead." According to Dottie, Edwards would later claim to have killed Brenda Holland on multiple occasions while he was intoxicated. Dottie believed her former husband killed Brenda in a case of mistaken identity. While Dottie was older than Brenda, both women were tall and thin, with long necks and bobbed blonde hair. If Edwards had come across Brenda from behind as she was walking home from Danny Barber's home, in his intoxicated state and with his headlights as his only source of light, he may have thought that Brenda was Dottie and attacked her, as he had a long history of doing to his wife. with so little light and in such an inebriated state, he may not have noticed that he had killed a different woman even after he strangled her, potentially with the braided rope straps of her handbag. Still drunk and still without light, he conceivably still could have believed the woman he killed was Dottie, even after putting her body in his car and taking it to a nearby bridge to throw it into the water. Edwards also would have had reason to believe his wife would have been in the neighborhood where he theoretically came across Brenda. Dottie was friends with both of Danny Barber's housemates and worked with one of them. Edwards did not like that his wife was friends with the young men and may have been in that area that night, checking to see if she were at their house. Dottie had, in fact, stopped at the house earlier in the evening during her drive around town with her best friend. No one was at the house when she arrived, so she took a beer from the fridge and left a note before leaving. Edward's behavior seems to indicate that for a time he did believe that he had killed his wife. He had his mistress come over to the home he shared with Dottie, which was not something he typically did. Neighbors saw her car at his house on Saturday and Sunday. Edwards went to the sheriff's office around 1 a.m. on the morning of Sunday, July 2nd, to report his wife missing, but claimed that she had left home after an argument just a few hours earlier, when she had actually left more than 24 hours earlier. After making his report, he went home and went to bed after about 20 minutes, potentially indicating that he was not actually concerned about anything authorities might find looking for Dottie, and that he had just made the report with the incorrect timeline to make it appear as though he was appropriately concerned for his wife. He was never questioned about the inconsistencies between his timeline and the statements of his neighbors, despite the fact that they were obvious and known to investigators well before Edwards was cleared as a suspect. Former Sheriff Cahoon, who had retired a few years before Dottie Fry's claims were made public, did not support the theory that Brenda's murder had been the result of mistaken identity, arguing that Brenda had been smothered with a pillow or blanket, indicating that he was still a proponent of the theory that she had been killed in someone, presumably Danny Barber's, house. However, the pathologist had found that Brenda had been strangled, not suffocated, and no evidence contradicted that finding. Brenda's family was not notified when Dottie made her statement to the SBI. They only learned of this alternative suspect in the case when a relative happened to read the newspaper article Ray Pye wrote after speaking with Dottie. The family had still received periodic phone calls from Sheriff Cahoon as the years passed, but he always told them that Danny Barber was the most likely suspect, and they simply lacked enough evidence to file charges against him. Brenda's murder devastated her family, affecting her siblings and her parents in different but profound and painful ways. Her father, Charles, believing Sheriff Cahoon's assertion of Danny's probable guilt, grew angry with the sheriff for failing to make the case against the young man. He would also express his regret over not exacting revenge against the man he believed killed his daughter. Neither of Brenda's parents would live to see their daughter's case resolved. Charles Holland passed away in 2003, and his wife Geraldine followed a decade later. They are both buried near Brenda in their family plot. In 2018, in response to a series of articles written by John Raley for the Coastland Times about Brenda's murder, the SBI assigned a specialized cold case investigator to the case. Unfortunately, Brenda's case may not benefit from the passage of time and the advancement of science the same way other older cases have in recent years. Problems with the evidence in Brenda's case began almost as soon as the investigation did. The necklace she always wore was removed, rinsed, and photographed after she was pulled from the water. The necklace was then given to her father just a few hours later. While this was, of course, an act of kindness towards Charles Holland, the necklace would have been of great evidentiary importance, especially given the fact that it was determined that Brenda had been strangled. The clothes Brenda was found wearing were washed shortly after her body was found, potentially eliminating trace evidence, along with the strong smell that most likely led to them being cleaned. This is not currently relevant, however, as the clothes could not be tested now, regardless of them having been washed. All of the physical evidence from Brenda's case has been lost. Previously, physical evidence from cases the SBI was involved in remained stored at the SBI laboratory. Following a policy change, evidence in these cases was returned to the local law enforcement agencies with whom the cases originated. It is not clear if the evidence from Brenda's case went missing while it was in the custody of the SBI or the Dare County Sheriff's Office. It is not unheard of for evidence from older cases to be intentionally destroyed, but there is no record of this occurring, and it would be unusual for evidence from a case that had received so much statewide attention to have been destroyed. Ongoing efforts to solve the case are also hampered by the fact that there are no photos from the crime scene or of Brenda's body to examine. According to notes from the SBI file, a state trooper took photographs at the scene near where Brenda's body was found, but the exposures were all blank when they were developed. Renowned local photographer Acock Brown also took photographs at the scene, and 2 witnesses have reported seeing the photos in the past, but the current whereabouts of the photos are unknown. They are not with the case files or with Mr. Brown's private collection of his photographs, which was donated to the Outer Banks History Center. No photos from Brenda's autopsy in Virginia can be located either. While the evidence against Dr. Linus Edwards is only circumstantial, Brenda's younger sister, Kim Holland Thorne, believes he is most likely the killer, and that his connections to local law enforcement influenced the investigation into Brenda's murder. After speaking with Dottie and others in Manteo, I concluded that Sheriff Cahoon's friendship with Dr. Edwards kept the whole truth from being divulged. When Dr. Edwards committed suicide, there was sort of an attitude of let sleeping dogs lie, she told the Raleigh News and Observer in 1997. Investigative efforts on the case did seem to die down following Edwards' death, except for the SBI keeping track of where Danny Barber was living and working. Kim Thorne has asked that the SBI formally declare Edwards as Brenda's killer based on Dottie Fry's statements, but the agency has not agreed to do so. They did offer to close Brenda's case without identifying her murderer, but Kim will not stand for that. I said, "Oh hell no. It will not be closed until you say who the killer was," she said in 2018. She furthermore wants both her sister and the consequences of unprofessionalism to not be forgotten. "I want it remembered. I want it at the top of the list for unsolved murders in North Carolina. They need to remember that sometimes the good old boys club doesn't work, and it's wrong," she told WTKR News in 2018. Brenda's memory, of course, lives on in the hearts and minds of her family and friends, but they hope to preserve her memory in Manteo as well. For several years, there have been efforts to get a plaque memorializing Brenda installed somewhere on the property where the Lost Colony continues to be performed each summer. This process has been complicated by the fact that the property is a part of the National Park Service and subject to certain rules and regulations. Hopefully these issues can be resolved, so that whether or not her case is ever solved, Brenda can be remembered by all of those who come to see the play that tragically showcased her final work more than 50 years ago.